Okay, good afternoon, folks. I'm Rose Stevenson. I'm the Director of Policy and Strategy at the Higher Education Policy Institute, also known as HEPI. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar, where we will be exploring different merger structures and their potential advantages and disadvantages in the higher education sector. We're going to chat about the potential different structures you can have, examine how similar grouping models are used in the US, and consider some experiences from the school sector as well. Now, I, for one, am absolutely in learning mode today, and I imagine that's the case for quite a lot of higher education colleagues who are watching along. We have 1 hour for this webinar. We'll spend the first half an hour with our panelists, and we'll spend the second half an hour answering your questions. If you pop your questions in the Q&A box, so there's a chat box and there's a Q&A box. So questions in the Q&A box, upvote the questions you want to see asked, and we'll ask them based on the most popular questions. We do like a bit of audience interaction, so we will put your microphone on and you can put your question to the panel. If you don't want to speak or can't speak, just put a little note or ask it anonymously, and I will put your question to the panel. So I will quickly run through who we're going to hear from today. So first up, we've got Professor Diana Beech, who is the director of the Finsbury Institute at City St George's, University of London. And Diana has been there since April last year, where she also serves as the Assistant Vice President for Policy and Government Affairs. And Diana is also formerly of this parish of HEPI, having held my role the first time around. Diana will also be joined by Alex Hall, who is the General Counsel and Director of Governance and Legal Services at City St George's and was previously at the University of Hertfordshire. Then we will hear from John Henniff, who's kindly joining us from the States this afternoon. John is a Senior Director at Huron, specialising in designing and implementing strategies that optimise the effectiveness of human resources in educational institutions. And finally, we will hear from Sir John Coles, who's a Chief Executive of United Learning. This is a group of over 100 academies and independent schools. John spent 15 years at the Department of Education and its predecessors, and he's bringing a wealth of experience from the 14 to 19 space. And I think really this is a part of the education sector that we, the higher education part of the sector, may want to take some learning from. So that is plenty from me. I will pass over to Diana and Alex.
Thank you very much, Rose. Can I just check you can hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And Rose, it's really, really great to see the Director of Policy and Advocacy role go from strength to strength. So it's now in good hands. And thank you to the HEPI team for having us here this afternoon. So as you can see, I'm one part of the City St George's double act this afternoon. I'm joined by my colleague Alex Hall, General Counsel of the University. And we joined the university actually at the same time, and me being me came up with a bit of a nickname for us both. That's Legal and General. You can tell which is which. So it's very much in that ethos today that I'm going to be talking to you. I'm going to start off with a broad sort of, bird's eye view of a generalist policy perspective on university mergers and collaborations, before I hand over to Alex, who'll go into a little bit more detail on the specifics of what's possible, what works, and what must be avoided. I am going to maintain a balanced position wherever possible as I go through the points that I'm going to make, because I think it's not my job as a policy person to tell you what to think about university mergers and collaborations, but it's to give you some suggestions about how to think about them. And that's looking at the both positives and the negatives as well. So in the remainder of my 5 minutes, I'm going to be ambitious and try and cover 5 short policy perspectives on university collaborations. So without further ado then, here's policy point number 1, and that is scale is a means to an end and not an end in itself. There's no doubt that collaborative models provide benefit, scale and reach to institutions that are entering into them. But this scale needs to be used strategically to see further gains afterwards, and it shouldn't be seen as symbolically, just to show status and we're bigger than everyone else. So what I mean by that point is that size and scale should not be the ultimate ambition or the end goal for universities entering into collaborative arrangements, because if consolidation is driven only by the optics of being seen to be bigger and better, then it risks becoming a hollow exercise. Now, of course, I'm not saying that pooling your finances or your disciplinary strengths can seem appealing, but in effect, if you're just doing this without changing anything at the back end and the structures and how you operate, then you're just plastering over the difficulties that you've got for a period of time, and you risk making the problem worse in the long term. And not to mention, it's going to be administratively burdensome and bureaucratic as well. So it's only going to add to the complexity that you're facing rather than reduce it. So my end point on this lesson is bigger systems don't necessarily mean better systems. Okay, moving on to policy perspective number 2. That is that governance must be simpler and not just different. So collaborative models should reduce complexity in university governance and not just layer on more of it like a cake, adding more tiers. I think when it's done well, university collaborations can offer an opportunity for institutions to rethink their governance systems, to go back to basics, to clarify their accountability structures and to strengthen their strategic oversight. We know that governance effectiveness is increasingly coming under the spotlight in universities across the UK at the moment, and we have seen cases where governing bodies have perhaps not been exercising sufficient due diligence or, have found themselves stretched too thinly across, operational matters. So what collaborations can do in this regard is offer an opportunity for institutions to step back, to look at what they've got wrong and to rectify this. I think the key, though, is not to fall victim to the tendency to create yet more layers of governance on top of existing ones, or even duplicating responsibility for things, because that's a risk when you find yourself with 2 or more players in the mix. And when you get to the point where nobody can explain who decides on what within a bigger structure, then that system just isn't going to work. So governance does need to be a key consideration in discussions about collaboration from the outset, and it can't just be something that's thought about or as an add-on afterwards. Point 3, that is that place must matter, even if it becomes blurred. So for me, university collaborations must not dilute that local, civic and economic role of a university. Now, I know that place is probably the strongest driver of consolidation. That's when 2 or more institutions come together in a single town or city or region. But then when they do so, that concept of their place automatically gets bigger. Successful collaborations or partnerships are one which will strengthen place-based impact by coordinating activity better across the respective campuses, sharing infrastructure and addressing cold spots collectively. And when they're done well, that can enhance local relevance and impact. However, there is a real risk in any larger group structure that decision-making can drift away from what were effectively those, really hyper-local areas of impact and reach. And so stakeholder groups become bigger, and there's a risk that some will also get forgotten in a much larger group structure. So I think the key here is not to get carried away with making efficiencies when it comes to people and communities. The bottom line is you can't aggregate trust in people and your communities in the same way as you can a balance sheet and your finances. So ways need to be found to bring everyone along on the journey with you. My 4th point is kind of related to that trust point, actually, and that is, crowd out autonomy, drive out trust. University collaborations succeed or fail on how well they protect the autonomy of their constituent institutions. Well-designed ones will allow their component parts to retain their academic identity and their unique brand and feel, while also benefiting from, the new shared governance and collaboration structures to help them to do more. And I think that's particularly the case if we're talking about some of the smaller specialist institutions being integrated into larger ones. But the flip side of this is that too much centralisation could be particularly damaging. It could threaten diversity, it can erode trust, and it can trigger cultural resistance in the wider university community. And I know HEPI has produced a report before that talks about the cultural change in universities and particularly the particular slowness of achieving that. So I think that's something that needs to be borne in mind by everyone entering into a collaborative agreement. So yeah, this is where the people factor comes into play again. And the lesson here is that while we can mandate compliance, we can't mandate people's commitment. So care care should be taken to keep internal communities happy, and again, to bring them along on the journey with you. And so my fifth and final point, a bit of a whirlwind tour, is that university collaborations are a policy tool. They are not a policy solution. I know we're spending an hour today discussing the merits and the benefits of different sort of university mergers and collaborations, but we do need to remember that there is no one-size-fits-all option here. Different solutions will suit different types of institutions and different contexts, and just because something works for one set of institutions, then this mustn't be seen as the silver bullet and the default pathway into the promised new world that will work for everybody. For some institutions, particularly those under acute financial strain at the moment, multi-university trust models offer a more viable alternative to an outright merger. And let's be frank, they're certainly more palatable than market exit or ongoing fragility. But for others, perhaps an outright merger is the way to go. So we do need to keep our options opening when we're exploring possible future models. And we do need to be alert to other forms of collaborations that not many people are talking about, things like federations, alliances, shared service models, or even mission-led arrangements. We have mission groups in the sector. Why can't we formalise that into an arrangement? Just throwing it out there. So let's not fall into the trap of assuming that those models have already been pursued are the way forward. There might be other doors that would open yet. So those of you that know me would have heard me say already probably that the diversity of the UK higher education sector is for me what makes it so special. And the same goes, I think, for the models of universities that will be emerging in the sector as well. So I'm going to finish by saying a resilient higher education system needs to be built on this diversity and pluralism. We're not going to achieve anything through uniformity. So I think pursuing options that will make us more of the same is not going to safeguard the future of our sector. And on that note, I'm going to hand it over to Alex to talk you through a little bit more of the specifics.
Thank you. That was seamless, wasn't it? So I'm going to look a bit at the legal lens. I'm not going to be too legalistic because I thought, you know, we're not all lawyers in the room, but I'll give a little bit of legal background. So broadly, I'm going to give three thoughts on what we, and by we I mean City St George's, have learned going through a merger process ourselves. What the options are or maybe, and what would maybe make life easier. Now, I should say, when I say what have we learned, and neither Diana nor I were at this university when it merged. We're here since, but it's very much part of this university and its everyday life at the moment. For more details, HEPI are publishing a report on our merger, which is coming out later this week, so look out for that. I know we'll say more about that later. But some quick topics from what City St George's has learned. First of all, it can be done. Seize the opportunity. I think there's a lot of concern about how difficult and complex it is. That's true, but it can be done, and that is our experience. And at City St George's, they got on and did it, and it's been worth it. And I think that's a message that comes across in our report. There must be a compelling proposition, not just financial necessity. It can't just be about trying to make the finances balance. City, we looked for an obvious strategic fit, and that is built around our idea of a health and healthcare powerhouse, bringing together what was already existing at Legacy City and Legacy St George's. So you need to look for that before considering, you know, how to collaborate. What's the strategic fit? How can you come together? A joint plan and roadmap is key. I think both of our councils at the two legacy universities got on top of that very quickly, did joint financial planning, and it was really a precondition to sort of having that common understanding all the way through the deal. And that continues to influence how we do things now. The next two bullet points really go together. Scale does bring resilience, but it also brings complexity, and integration is a long haul. And believe me, we are still going through that. We are still integrating. It's a long job. There's lots to be done. And we've wrapped some pretty strong governance around it. We have an integration board which oversees how we are integrating and what we are doing. But it's not something that's going to be, you know, fixed on the day you sign the agreement. It's something which comes in the months and years following on from that. That said, it's a fascinating bit of work to be involved in, and I found it really interesting joining last year. Final point, what we've learned, keep communicating with all stakeholders. When you merge, everyone has a view of what the merged institution should be or could be. And you've got to keep telling them, you know, this is what we're doing, this is why we're doing it, this is where we're heading. It's really important because it's a big change and it brings a lot of work with it. And your people, by which I mean all stakeholders, staff, students, parents, they need to understand why you've done it, where you're going, and what the benefits will be. And some of those benefits will be much longer term. They're not going to happen on day one. So you have to keep that communication going. So there's lots of options, but not much choice. What do I mean by that? Well, broadly, I mean, there's been lots of seminars on this recently in the sector. People have looked at back office JVs, they've looked at contractual alliances, federations, group structures, and formal mergers. There are lots of options available, but really there's only a few that will deliver true financial benefits. And by that, I mean the sort of economies of scale that you can get by bringing entities together and you know and achieving those economies of scale. But there's trade-offs that are involved in that, and some of my bullet points here really articulate what needs to be thought about. You know, strong versus weak partner dynamic being key. It is key. How you decide what you're doing, how you decide what the entity at the end is going to look like, depends on the relative bargaining power of the individual entities involved. And I think, you know, let's be honest, all the mergers that have happened recently in the sector and are potentially ongoing at the moment, there's always that dynamic of stronger, weaker partner, and you need to think about how that might play out. When is a merger truly a merger of equals? I don't think we've had a sector merger where you can truly say that the two universities are equals. There's lots of dynamic there, and that is worth thinking through. How does that work? What does this institution want? What does that institution want? How will we work that out between us? But quite often, what you end up with at the end as the end entity, it looks like what it looks like because of how that bargaining has taken place. So that is worth thinking about. You know, there'll be entities, universities out there who are in a weak position who may need someone to come in and help them out. There'll be others who are going to be the helping out partner. What's your proposition? Why would you do this? How will you treat your partner? These are very important things to consider. Is there such a thing as a multi-university trust or a multi-university group? Well, no, if we're comparing with the academy sector. So we very clearly have multi-academy trusts in the secondary sector, and those have developed over many years following sort of reforms that Michael Gove brought in from about 2010 onwards. But there's nothing that exists quite in the same way in the university sector. So multi-academy trusts, you have a trust at the top, but within it there's several schools that have their own local governing bodies, have their own identities. That's not something which the regulator permits at the moment. So all of our mergers that we see and all of the ongoing mergers, there's going to be one vice chancellor, one board, one academic board, or whatever you call it, council or senate, depending on what terminology you use. And that is what the regulator expects. I think we've not seen it develop as far as groups with separate universities maintaining that separate autonomy. That is something which we're still to see. But as Diana said, you know, that's not to say it won't happen in the future. So what would help? My thinking is, I mean, there's four very obvious bullet points there. I think, as I was saying, on multi-university trust, we can't really do what we do because the regulators have got very clear views on what structure should look like. Greater regulatory flexibility would probably help. If, you know, we could develop understandings with the OFS, with other regulators as to how different types of structure might work and whether we could bring autonomous universities together in some sort of trust or structure. I think that there's an opportunity there to really develop the sector and find ways of collaborating that don't currently exist but could exist, drawing on other sectors, and we might hear more from that from others on this call shortly. Greater clarity on competition law. I should be fair to the CMA on this. They've just published guidance 2 weeks ago for the sector, so please do look at that. I've been asked by colleagues in DSIT to say this guidance is available. I mean, personally, I think principles of competition law are fairly clear, but you know, there's all sorts of questions, particularly in higher education sector, about what is the relevant market, how do you determine whether courses compete, you know, so there are complications. So I will take that clarity on that would be more helpful. An independent broker, I mean, this is what both the FE and the secondary sectors have had. The FE sector had a broker based in the DFE who was effectively a commissioner helping with mergers. Obviously, in the secondary sector, they've got regional school commissioners as well who help in that process. It might help if we had someone doing that. I don't think it should be the regulator. I think it should be independent of the regulator, but I think someone who can help with those sort of conversations from an objective perspective would be helpful. And, you know, we'd all like some government money, wouldn't we? I mean, I think it's not cheap to do these deals. It's not cheap to do mergers, and the integration costs as well as the legal costs are huge. I think if there were, you know, what they did in the academy sector was provide money to help schools become academies and to join trusts. You know, if you're integrating two universities, maybe some money for an integrated student record system that the new merged entity can use would be helpful. That sort of thing would help smooth some of the complexities. I think that brings us to the end of the City St George's bit. Thank you very much for listening to us, and we'll hand on to the next speaker.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I have multiple questions, but I'm just going to pose one for now, Alex. You said that there is kind of regulatory restrictions on forming multi-university trusts or similar structures to that. I wondered if you could just give us some more detail on that for folks who don't nerdily read OFS conditions of registration like we might.
I mean, I think people automatically compare with multi-academy trusts because that's what's known and that's what people have seen. And those structures involve several schools coming together under one trust structure. So they become one legal entity, but the schools maintain their individual identities. So you've got individual schools with governing bodies, with brands that are put together under a sort of scheme delegation arrangement. Now, Kent and Greenwich, to be fair with them, have moved in this sort of direction, as far as I understand the deal. And I'm not involved in that deal, but as far as I understand it, we've got two universities that have come together. But there's no separate governance arrangements. I'm sure there are people on this call who can actually say more about this, and they may wish to do so. But so there's still going to be one vice chancellor, I think it's a board of governors and an academic board, and then underneath that, the two universities will maintain their brands, but they're still effectively merged as one entity rather than maintaining separate. So it's a bit of a legal nuance, but we haven't got to the same place. Now, I think they're calling it a group, aren't they? So I mean, it's not like a multi-academy trust. We've not quite moved in that direction. But that's not to say, that's because the regulator requires that one vice chancellor, that very clear structure. If they were persuaded or interested in sort of having discussions about, could there be alternatives to that? That might be interesting. It might be possible to move to a structure that's more similar to what the academies have done. Does that answer your question?
Kind of, and I think Sir John's going to talk a little bit more about that in his section as well. But if people do still have questions, pop them in the chat and we will come back to it. So next up, we will hear from John Henneth. So if, John, you could pop on your mic and your camera and we will hear the stateside view.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rose. So my name is John Henneth. I've been with Huron Consulting Group for the last 19 years. Focused on working with universities to implement shared services models. So just a brief overview of Huron. Huron Consulting Group is a global management consulting firm. We work closely with colleges and universities to strengthen financial performance, improve operational performance, and enhance the overall student experience. We have 7,000 professionals worldwide with locations in North America, Europe, and Asia Pacific. And so I've been asked to just give a brief overview of the markets and trends we're seeing in the US market. And so for the last 10 years, we have seen a significant increase in the M&A market with a strong transition to shared services model. This is a growing trend in the US, mainly driven by financial pressures, workforce challenges, and rising expectations for consistency and service quality. And while there are many different models, the direction has been clear. Universities are increasingly centralizing the move to administrative shared services functions. So in the US, we have roughly 60 university systems. Of those 60 university systems, approximately a quarter have already moved to a shared services model for administrative functions. We are most often seeing the transition in human resources, finance, administrative, information technology, and research administration. And if those 60 universities, if they have not already moved to a shared services model, they are actively pursuing, exploring, piloting the approach to move to a more centralized approach. The best examples of university systems that have already adopted a centralized shared services model, I would reference the University System of California, State University of New York, and the University System of Georgia. So in the US, in addition to our system-based models, we also have some universities that participate in consortium-style shared services arrangement. This is where legally independent institutions collaborate together to centralize their administrative functions. The best well-known consortium-style examples in the US the Claremont colleges in California, the Five College Consortium in Connecticut, and the Tri-Health College Consortium in Pennsylvania. So I'm happy to take some additional questions in the Q&A, discuss the trends we're seeing in the US, and delighted to be a part of the conversation today.
Thanks, John. Can I just ask, you've talked about moving to centralised shared services and large numbers of institutions doing that. Is that institution-led? So, or are those services provided by external consultancies, etc.?
Yes, great question. Certainly for the system, the university systems that operate in the US, those are all internally system-led. When we start talking about those consortium style examples, Claremont Colleges, Five Colleges Consortium in Pennsylvania, most often they do have to set up a infrastructure to support that. It is often, it remains with internal staff, internal operations, but the governance of that can bring in some external governance just to make sure that each of the organizations that participated is represented, has a voice in the decision making, and oftentimes there is some external support there.
Really interesting. Thank you. Okay, finally over to Sir John for thoughts from the wider education sector. John, over to you.
Thank you. I can't start my video, seemingly. There we go. Thank you. Thanks very much for having me. I am going to try to talk quickly about multi-academy trust system, which we've had mention of already. And I want to start, and I won't try and draw out all of the analogies to the HE system because I don't really have time. Obviously, I can answer questions on that later, but hopefully you'll be able to draw from this something about what's a good analogy and what's a less close analogy. But I think there are some very similar things that can be done. So firstly, what is a multi-academy trust? Well, very simply, all a multi-academy trust is a group of schools with common governance. So I think that is the same actually as Greenwich and Kent, which is two universities with common governance. As with universities, there must be one person in charge who is called the accounting officer for this purpose. Usually that person is the chief executive. It is a single legal entity. There's one set of accounts, there's one board, there's one accounting officer. It can be any number of schools, they can be anywhere. Each school continues to have some identity of its own. It has its own DFE number, and for inspection and for some regulatory purposes, it's treated as a separate entity, although legally speaking, the only entity is the trust. Schools are funded on the same way, whatever their legal structure. So based on pupil numbers fundamentally, plus the characteristics of those pupils. And there's neither a premium nor a penalty for being in a trust. So the totality of our funding is the same as the totality of the funding of our schools would be were they separate legal entities. What is United Learning, secondly? We are a sort of slightly extreme outlying multi-academy trust because we're much bigger than anyone else, firstly. Secondly, because we existed for about 120 years before the Academies programme was founded by Andrew Adonis and Tony Blair. Back at the turn of the millennium. We were founded as a group of independent schools for girls. Our independent schools charity is separate from our multi-academy trust, but it is effectively the prototype of a multi-academy trust. In other words, it's a group of about a dozen now schools under common governance as a charity. We've got just over 100 schools. As you can see, we're kind of the length of the country. We go up to Carlisle, down to the south coast, not quite the breadth, England only. Compared to the biggest universities in financial terms, we're not huge. It's about, across those 100 schools, it's about £800 million of turnover. In terms of number of people educated, we are big, 75,000 children and young people in our schools right across the country. What is this structure, secondly? So there's one board, which is the overall trust board. The trust board is the accountable body for the trust. So it's a single charity with a single board. Um, Reporting to the trust board is an executive team. So I'm the chief executive. I have CFO, HR director, technology. I've got education directors, primary, secondary, and independent. Below our education directors, we have a team of regional directors. Our regional directors are people who have been outstanding heads fundamentally and are now supporting and line managing a number of heads across the country. Each school has its own head, and the head reports to the regional director. There are various ways you can structure this. In our model, there are still local governing bodies. It's not a requirement that you have a local governing body. Some people have academy councils, some people have local advisory groups. We do have a local governing body. However, neither the school nor the head really reports to the local governing body. The local governing body does challenge and support and is a sort of critical friend, but the actual reporting line is back through the executive team to the trust board. So that is, roughly speaking, our structure. And I suppose I'd want to emphasize not really the structure so much as there needs to be some clarity, there needs to be space for leadership, and there needs to be accountability for this to work. So it's a bad idea in my view. I mean, you've seen from our overall shape geographically, more than 100 schools right across the country, often in areas of significant disadvantage, but also with a group of independent schools, which typically are an advantaged group of schools. We've got primary schools, we've got secondary schools, we've got all through schools. Trying to run schools by remote control would be a terrible idea. We don't have a one size fits all model. We consider ourselves to be a national group of local schools. In other words, each individual entity in the group has significant autonomy. We need head teachers who are capable of leading their schools and who are effective leaders, because that makes everything else work well as well. So these points about leadership, clarity, accountability, we think are fundamental to making this model work, much more than what's the detail of the structure and so on. How do we work? Well, we do have a central team. Our central team does compliance, so health and safety, safeguarding, legal and COSAC functions. We have a set of centrally led functions: finance, HR, data, marketing, estates, projects, and so on, all of which are a group-wide function done once for everyone, but with local presence as part of that. And we have a group of people who provide educational support. So most importantly, really the regional directors, but around them, a group of subject advisors, people who've been excellent heads of department, for example, who can support maths, English, modern foreign languages, art, music, sport, and so on, and make sure that our heads of department have very strong professional support. And many of that central team, we call them a central team, but actually they're often field-based because they spend the bulk of their time in schools. The central team isn't the trust. The schools are the trust. And the central team provides typically support services that all schools need. So if we're doing something at the centre, it's because that's a thing that schools need. A school on its own would need some finance, HR, technology support. We're doing it at the centre only because we think that improves efficiency and effectiveness overall. People have different views of centralisation. You can make different choices about what you centralise and what you don't. Our principle is that we don't centralise unless we are convinced by efficiency and effectiveness. Obviously, the centre can do, and the trust as a whole can do things that schools mostly don't do. So we do train, but could. We do train 400 new teachers a year on behalf of the government. We do early career training for a similar number, particularly in central London, where we run what's called the Teaching School Hub, and in Swindon and Wiltshire, where we have the same role. We run an apprenticeship training provider. We've recently set up what is now a separate charity, United Communities, which does community work in the areas where we have schools. So again, this is very much about local leadership and presence and a sort of civic responsibility. We have a single entity, but it's led locally. We think there are some pretty big benefits from this structure in the schools world. Obviously, universities typically are much bigger institutions than single schools, and that changes all sorts of things. But we can get economies of scale through being a single entity, straightforwardly procurement and other services that we can do more cheaply. We can be more efficient in a range of ways. So we can get things more cheaply. We can get more output for the input, so more efficient. The way our back office systems work, the way we do things which are sort of build once, use many times, like resources in support of the curriculum and so on, very powerfully get cheaper and cheaper per school, per pupil, the bigger we get. And typically, through making economies and efficiencies, we're able to put more money back into education than individual schools can, some of which is our centrally led educational and quality support functions. So the teams under our education directors and regional directors, which are providing educational support. We think we get, in fact, I'm very confident we get many of the best people in the sector to come and work for us because they have the ability to have a bigger impact through working with us than they could do in other roles. We have a depth and breadth of expertise and we have capacity to do a wide range of things. We're able to spread the impact of the best leaders. And I think really importantly, we're building a big network, which means that whatever your role in the school, whatever you're teaching, whether you're a member of support staff, you have a network of really high quality colleagues all over the country from whom you can learn, who lead professional development, who you can support and provide a different sort of professional network than exists elsewhere in the school sector. So at a very quick canter, that is us and what we do. I haven't tried to draw out the similarities and differences, but obviously we can develop that in due course.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And it's clear there's a real theme coming through here about kind of shared services and that back office provision. So that has been pushed by the government for higher education without, I guess, the mechanisms of how it might happen. So obviously, Sir John, you've talked about it in terms of the school sector and multi-academy trusts, and John talked about it in different contexts for the different group kind of structures they've got in the US. But it seems like that is a big driver for this type of work.
Yeah, and look, those economies and efficiencies definitely exist in the school sector, and that is meaningful. And the more we grow, the more efficient and effective that has got. Obviously, there'll come a point where that ceases to be true, I guess. But just at the moment, we clearly are getting more efficient as we grow. However, I wouldn't say for us, so I would emphasize for us that the other benefits of this in terms of leadership, professional growth and development, spreading the impact of the most effective people, specialization, sharing of education focused resources. Obviously, we don't do research, but we do a lot of education. I think those are much bigger benefits to us on the whole, and people don't talk about them because some of that is, when you get into the detail of that, it's a bit uncomfortable. Because it's talking about the quality and impact of people, isn't it? Rather than just a sort of abstract sense of efficiency. But I would say for us, those are the bigger benefits, actually. And that's not to sort of disparage the others, because clearly in this world, we can get bigger bang for our buck and put our resources where it's going to make the most difference to young people, then that is a thing we should definitely do. But yeah.
Yeah, great. Thank you. As a former teacher, I recognise that the kind of national structure of professional development, it was almost dismantled, I think somewhat accidentally. So it's great to see that being rebuilt through multi-academy trusts. Right, folks, if I could ask you to put your cameras back on and we will dive into the Q&A. So I have Kim Ansell first. So Emma, if we could have Kim's mic on. Kim, please put your question to the panel.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you. And I'm just interested, having come St City St George's post the merger, if your reflections led you to think about anything that you would have done differently if you'd been there at the time.
Thank you, Kim. I will take Hugh's question as well while Alex and Diana have a think about this one. Over to you, Hugh.
Yeah, thanks very much, Rose. So my question is, how would you know if a merger or joint venture had failed, and what would you do about that? I'm aware that there have been many multi-academy trusts that have experienced difficulties, and I'm not sure what the consequence of something like that happening in the university sector might be.
Really good question, Hugh. Thank you. And I will put one anonymous question as well, which is the theory of all of this, mergers, shared services, etc., makes a lot of sense. But the barriers always seem bigger than they need to be. How have people approached breaking down these barriers to make real progress in this space? So, Diana and Alex, over to you first. You weren't there when this merger happened, but on reflection, what might the institution have done differently?
It's an interesting question, isn't it? I mean, I think whenever you've been through these sort of big deals, there's things you can do at different times, and it's whether what you get done before you merge and what you get done after you merge, and where those things happen. So, I mean, the legacy universities that came together, their governance and academic structures were very different. We had different IT systems. We had different processes for doing things, and a lot of that is being sorted out after the event. And there's always a question, how much can you sort out before you merge? Could you, the reason I said when I talked about more government money, could you buy could they pay for a student system that will come in and go across the whole institution? It's just that, you're bringing together two institutions that will have done things differently, and you've got to find a way of making that work. And I think probably, speaking honestly, I would say that, there may be things which we could have thought about earlier and planned for more in order to integrate more quickly now. That's not to say that integration isn't going ahead and isn't working, but there's always things you can plan earlier in the hope of it working out better after the event. But the other thing is with a merger like this, you've got to put a line in the sand. You've got to make it happen. If you spend too much time thinking about all of this, it doesn't happen. And you can go round and round in circles and trying to plan. Actually, there comes a point where you have to say, okay, we have merged and we will sort out what needs to be sorted out after the merger. So swings and roundabouts. But yeah, I mean, in answer to the question, you can plan more and get more done in advance, and that's probably a good thing to do. That said, you're still going to be working stuff out afterwards anyway.
Diana, you talked about making governance simpler, or keeping it as simple as you could in your introduction. I wonder if that was a piece that should be planned in advance. So traditional university governance, I'm sure it's similar in schools. You kind of meet 4 times a year, et cetera, et cetera. And that feels like it wouldn't work necessarily as you kind of plan for and take forward a merger. Do you need to plan your governance to make sure you've got the right expertise, people with the right time commitment, et cetera, before you step into this?
That's a great question, Rose. And I think the answer is yes. I mean, when you enter a merger, you automatically need different skill sets on the board. So I think the first thing you need to do is devise a skills matrix of let's say 2 institutions that you've got. Look what capacity, what skills you've got on that board. Look where the gaps are. Make a plan on how you're going to fill it and how you're best going to utilize the people that you have got in the first instance, because that's your goodwill right there. They've been on the journey with you, and you need to make sure that they've got a role going forwards. And you've got to clarify what that role will be as well, and how that will change from the institution that they're in now to when they become bigger in a sort of group structure. So yes, I think governance is a big thing that we need to plan for. And I think, universities by and large do that, single institutions, because the financial climate that we're in at the moment is requiring a different skill set as it is. So this is something that we need to just sort of amplify really if entering a merger.
Great, thank you. So John, I wonder if you could address Hugh's question about how do you know if it's worked or indeed if it's failed? And obviously it's slightly different in higher education compared to the school sector, because a university can literally go bankrupt.
Yeah, well, so can a school. What happens when a school goes bankrupt is they get taken over by somebody else, generally. Look, I mean, the reality is that we take over a lot of schools which are in trouble for one reason or another. So, I mean, it's worth thinking about the independent school side of this as well. Typically, the sort of ways in which state schools get in trouble are educational. So we take over a lot of schools which have failed Ofsted. Now, we do also take over, enlightened schools which think actually we need to be part of a bigger entity and that will help us. But we take over a lot of schools which have failed, and so it's a turnaround job. And the question of whether what we've done has worked or not is judged fundamentally educationally. Do the children get a better deal after we take them over than they were getting before, and how quickly? And so there's a pace and urgency to what we do, which I think is different from a more sort of deliberative merger process in which we just take over a mass and sort it out. That's what we're for, really. The independent school side is a bit different. Obviously, we're just talking between friends, aren't we? So don't quote me on this. Typically, while state schools approach us because they're in an educational mess, independent schools approach us on the independent school side of our group because they're financially in a mess. People tend to want, I'm sure this will be true in HE as well, people tend to want to preserve their independence for as long as they possibly can until they realize that there are sort of storm clouds gathering and the sort of medium-term future doesn't look so rosy. So on the independent school side, the job is make sure that this school functions as a business, that it attracts enough children. And obviously part of that is making sure it delivers a great educational experience, but all of the business side of, universities applies very much here, as you know, independent schools can and do go out of business relatively frequently. So really, in the end, the question is, do we make this work financially and economically, and do we make it work educationally for the children? And if we answer both of those questions, yes, then we're winning on the whole. And I don't think it needs to be more complicated than that. And I think it is the same for universities.
I'm not sure it is educationally, only because, and I know that this is a barrier for some institutions, if you have a very strong institution and a weaker institution, so its outcomes aren't as good, its league table places aren't as good. If you have a true merger of those two entities, so two entities becoming one, that's quite a significant risk for the stronger institution, kind of regulatory. Now, maybe that's where you have to be clever about what type of merger you do to perhaps keep those entities different while you make those educational changes. But with the multi-academy trust system, obviously, it's not impacting. Those schools have their individual reputations and they maintain that multi-academy trust.
Yeah. And I mean, this is where the kind of multi-university trust idea is different from a straight merger. So, when UCL took over the Institute of Education, I mean, people called it a merger, but it was a takeover. There's no doubt about that. What we're talking about in Kent and Greenwich feels, to me, much more like a multi-university trust. You've got two institutions which are keeping their separate identity whilst being part of a single legal entity. Well, that is what a multi-academy trust is fundamentally. But I think you have to be, whatever your language is, I think you have to be quite hard-headed about it. We don't do mergers. I mean, we sometimes say it's a merger, but we don't do a merger. People join us and we take them over, and then they're run by us. That's what we do. And the way we run it is that we give people plenty of autonomy, and whilst they're doing a great job, we're behind them, we're supporting them. But if something's not good enough, we will step in and make sure it is good enough. And so I personally think universities should adopt the same approach. I don't see why that needs to be different. If you're extremely good at what you do, and if you're confident about what you do, and if you're genuinely high performing, not just trading on a kind of storied reputation, go in and sort somebody else out. Why are you not able to do that? So
that is a great challenge, John. Thank you. And John H., I wonder if you could address this question of barriers. It feels really difficult to do some of this shared services stuff. But obviously it's cracking on in the States. How are those barriers being lowered to allow this to happen?
Yeah, I think there's two main components of barriers. There's the change management component, where this is a difficult transition to go through, and you need to get buy-in and make sure that you have the right sponsorship. And then there is the barrier of, from a technology perspective, a policy perspective, it is very difficult to move to a more streamlined and harmonized set of policies and procedures and technology. So maybe I'll address both of those real quickly. From a change management perspective, and I also saw one of the questions lower on was maybe some of the lessons learned. I might point to the University of Michigan, who moved to a shared services model years and years ago. They were one of the first universities to make the transition. It was not well received. There is a tremendous amount of literature on how this went. Essentially, the decision was made at the executive level. The president, the provost, was not socialized and therefore was not well accepted across campus. Very, very minimal change management. And so one of the barriers that we usually like to address is it takes time. You need to get institutional buy-in. There is a tremendous amount of adoption and buy-in that needs to have before actually moving to a more centralized approach. And then the second barrier is really that technology component, policy, procedures. And this one comes down to making sure that the work is done in advance to simplify and streamline as much as possible to allow the merging entities to operate as a unified organization. And so if we just move to a model that allows universities, institutions to continue operating independently, you lose a lot of the value and financial benefit that comes along with it. So getting as much of that work done in advance of the merger, in advance of moving to a more unified shared services model, certainly helps take down the barriers and allow for a smoother integration once the merger actually takes place.
Great. Diana's already mentioned the paper that HEPI put out on change management by Paul Woodgate. It's really good paper. I would recommend that folk give it a read if they are doing anything anywhere near this size of change management at an institution. Okay, I'm going to take 3 more questions. I'm going to ask for succinct answers so we can get through them. So firstly, we have a question that's anonymous, and then Emma, I'm going to come to Mark Corbett for his question. So anonymous question first. It says, you've mentioned only a few options deliver true financial benefits. Would you be able to elaborate on this? And it says, I appreciate that financial necessity shouldn't be a primary driver. So do we have Mark for his question? Hi, Mark.
You hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Go ahead.
Oh, great. Yeah. So it's Mark Corbett, London Hire. Yeah, I was asking whether all this talk about mergers and the creation of groups could be opening up the markets for equity firms looking at UK HE acquisitions. Are there any risks on what should our response be to that?
Yeah, really good question, Mark. Thank you. And another good and quite spicy question. How does the franchising / subcontracting model fit in with mergers and acquisitions? So I will shout out for the questions that you want or address the ones you want to. Perhaps John H., if I come to you first, please. We've got acquisitions, franchising, and why is it that financial benefits are so limited?
So, again, back to my opening comments, I do think that the M&A move to a shared services model is being driven by the financial benefits. One of the ways that we have been able to highlight how effective it has been is really capturing current state operations, the time it takes to perform a lot of the administrative functions today, both from a salary wage perspective and operational costs. As I noted, some universities are a bit farther along on their journey, and we can now point back to showing a direct ROI that we are able to operate more efficiently from a salary and wage perspective, but also putting in place service level agreements that just capture how long it's taking to get the recruit to hire business process done, how long it's taking to close the books, how long it's taking to complete a journal entry. There is a lot of data available now that we can quantify hard dollar savings to say this is resulting in a more efficient operation and therefore contributing to the financial stability of a university. And so, again, I think the ROI has been a big component on demonstrating and now proving that it is really a more sustainable model to operate.
Thank you. City St. George's colleagues, thoughts on acquisitions from private equity and also how franchising and I guess validation as well fits into this?
Interesting questions. I mean, I think on the franchising side, I mean, it's a way in which universities expand their ability to deliver education through other providers, isn't it? So, I mean, that's effectively what franchising is used for. I mean, I think we're going through a time in this country where the regulator is looking quite carefully at how that is done, and potentially, I would say that now is possibly not. Oh, we may have missed the boat on franchising, because I think it's not a system that's smiled on necessarily at the moment. But that said, I mean, it's a form of collaborative education, isn't it? So it's not it's akin to a merger. You're unlikely, I think, to make encountering economies of scale by working through a franchise model. But I think if to flip it on its head, I'm talking about franchises as we understand it in the higher education sector. To talk about franchising in a commercial sense, I mean, could a university develop a brand which it then franchises out to other organisations, if that's what the question is meant to pick up? Why not? It's a commercial opportunity. I think we'd have to look at how the regulator would cope with that. But I mean, I think it's something that could be looked at.
And I think I should take the question from my former colleague, Mark, because that's only right, representing London Hire. That was on private equity. I don't see any reason why they're not looking at this at the moment. I'm not the lawyer here, but I do know that the Higher Education and Research Act did open up the landscape for new innovative forms of provision. I think we've seen quite a dearth of that actually quite recently. So this could be one way to resurrect it. There are some notable big private providers already operating in the sector with quality at their heart. So I think the risk would be you've got to watch out for those firms that spy an opportunity to make a quick buck. You've got to have a look who's already operating, where they're operating, and take time to realise that they do have those quality intentions, and it's not there just as another business opportunity in the loosest sense. So short answer, yes, I think they're looking.
I would add to that, obviously, most universities in the UK are charities and public bodies. So going private is a bit of a, there's a bit of a change. You're moving from a very one structure into a very different type of structure. So whether or not that, you'd have to think very carefully about whether the university wanted to, it's a Royal Charter institution. You're not going to keep that Royal Charter if you're transferred into a private group. So there's implications there as well.
Great. And so, John, if I could just put you on the spot with a final question before we wrap up. There's a question that says, what proportion of the total spend by United Learning goes on overheads to pay for the executive, shared services, etc.? Is there a standard overhead deduction, or does it vary between schools?
Can I just comment on private equity before I do that? I mean, there's only one reason that private equity invests in a business, and that's to make money. And let's all be just straightforward about that. And if you think it's a good idea to sell UK higher education to private equity, take a look at the care home market and the children's home market and see whether you think you want that for our higher education system. Just an opinion. And the answer to the question is £250 per pupil goes into all our central services, including everything we do at the Centre, finance, HR, technology, etc. So that's about 2.7% of total income, which obviously is much less than schools typically pay for similar services, as a result of which we're able to put much more into education, which is one of the things that is one of our purposes.
Great. So I'm going to wrap up in a second. I'm going to ask each of you for less than 30 seconds on the one thing that you would want governing bodies to have in their mind if they were looking at shared services or something bigger, a full merger. What is the one thing that they should have in their minds? I've given you no time to prepare for this. John H.
I would say, from a governance perspective, active sponsorship is key. You need to have the right leadership at the right levels, endorsing the model, supporting the model, and managing to pre-established metrics and financial targets that everyone is looking to achieve.
Great. And Sir John?
I think it is clarity, leadership, and accountability. I think if you've got clear common governance, you're clear who leads what and who's accountable to whom, and it's kept simple, then you've got a fighting chance of succeeding. If you start making it very complicated and trying to do lots of highly sophisticated collaborative things, your chances of saving money through shared services, franchising, or anything else quite low, I think.
Diana, and then Alex, please.
I think it's a strong answer to the question why. You know, I mean, most of our governing bodies are charitable trustees, and they're doing things with charitable funds, and they need to be able to explain and justify what they're doing. So, with a strong, justifiable rationale for doing this.
And mine would be people matter and people are unpredictable. So you might have all the facts right, but you've got to do that people management
Got to
piece.
bring your people with you. Yeah, great. Well, thank you so much, all of you, for your insights. We do have a paper out on Thursday on the City St George's merger. If you don't already get HEPI's emails, pop on the website and click sign up for HEPI Insights, and you can follow us on LinkedIn as well. So thank you to Emma and Carol in the background from the HEPI team for organising everything. Huge thanks to all our speakers for giving up their time to speak to us this morning, and for all of your questions. We never get through them all, for which I apologise. But thank you so much for your time, everybody. Good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.